second. It will write us that we are already streamed. I'm checking our page on Facebook. Oh, great. We are online. So hello, everyone. Very glad to introduce you our today's speaker, Mr. Blair Rubel, who is a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, who is a famous author, scholar, urbanist, and by the way, he holds an honorary doctorate from Ukraine's Modern Art Institute. And of course, he does a lot of different activities and helps Ukraine. And I want to thank you, the American Embassy in Ukraine, for supporting our project Bordering, Debordering, Rebordering, and to the Armed Forces of Ukraine and all the services that made it possible for us to stay in Kyiv and to be able to conduct this lecture, to hold this event. So glad to see you, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Rubel, for taking part in our project. And today we are going to talk about urban societies and how they receive their voices and how they are defined by their theater. But before giving floor to Mr. Rubel, Natalia Musienko, the CEO of Ukrainian Fulbright Circle, is going to tell a few words. So Natalia, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Oksana. Thank you so much, Blair, to be with us and to have this possibility and opportunity to give your lecture to us today. I would like to tell your colleagues that Blair Rubel is not only distinguished scholar, he is also our distinguished friend. And we greatly appreciate he is with us today at the day of the dignity and freedom, special day for us, the day of beginnings of two Maidans in 2004 and 2013, two Maidans that they were full of arts, that they have been territory of arts. And today, Blair Rubel will focus also on how art can change the world, of course. And very important things I would like also to underline that we still have books of Blair Rubel in the Fulbright office, the books that have not been distributed because first of COVID and then because of the war, but we are absolutely sure that very soon Blair Rubel will come to Kyiv to sign his books for all us, for all of us. Thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
And once again, just one notice for our viewers. If you hear the alarm siren, please go to the shelter and you will be able to watch the recording of this lecture on Ukrainian Fulbright Circle official webpage, on our Facebook page, in YouTube. So we will keep all the recordings there. And please, if you are watching us, you're welcome to leave your comments and your questions under this video. And in the end of the lecture, we will have a chance to answer your questions. So thank you. And Sarah, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. First, I have to say it's a tremendous honor to have been invited to participate in this remarkable seminar series. I am in awe of all of you who have made it possible, the organizers, the audience, the people who will be listening later on Facebook on the recording. Under these circumstances, it's just remarkable anyone has any interest in what I'm about to talk about. But hopefully, since you've made the special effort to do so, you'll find it of interest. I want to talk about the performing arts and their role in reflecting and maybe driving social change. You know, all too often we regard performing arts either as a pleasant add-on to some more serious aspect of life, or as an economic engine that generates income and drives economic development. The arts, of course, can be both, but it's their connection to our primal selves that adds an additional, often underappreciated dimension. By allowing performers and audiences alike to affirm their identities, they give potent expression to our desires. They become a rallying point when those aspirations seem thwarted. And this is particularly true when theaters erupt in riots. So I'm going to talk about three historical theater riots, but as a way of illustrating how theater performances can, in fact, tell us a lot about what's going on in society we might not see other ways. Now, individual performers have mobilized their supporters for millennia. They often turn audiences into cheering sections reminiscent of sporting events. Some performers hire cheering sections, and others have gone further. At times, artists have engaged in legendary, spiteful conflicts with their peers, often over artistic differences and personal slights. Such personality-driven fanaticism has merged over the centuries, I would argue, with disputes over new artistic forms, concerns over changing socioeconomic hierarchies, and ever more assertive nationalisms. And when that happens, they bring the curtain down on chaos inside and outside the theater, and they represent something more than just an artistic dispute. And those are the instances I want to talk about today, when such riotous performances mark moments when individuals and social groups cry out for respect. And I'm going to quickly try to share a couple images here. See if it shows up. Well, the images aren't that important, so we're not going to deal with that right now. Let me start first by talking about disputes over new artistic forms, because that's something we all understand can take place. And I want to do so by talking about one very specific incident that happened in Paris in the 1820s, because I think it reflects the way generational divisions find expression through artistic divisions, which then take on added meaning. Now, those who had come of age under the old regime embraced traditional understandings of how society in all its aspects should function, with a heavy measure of form over substance, predictability over innovation, hierarchy over parity and equality, and order over disarray. The elderly Charles X, the younger brother of Kings Louis XVI and XVIII, personified a Bourbon restoration imposed by victorious powers meeting in Vienna to construct Europe's post-Napoleonic settlement. By contrast, those who have come of age following the 1789 revolution and during Napoleon's war embraced the slogans of their era, praising liberty, equality, and fraternity. And they stood in stark opposition to all that the restored monarchy represented. So we see the coming together of generational change and artistic change. These political, social, and economic divisions found expression in the arts as classicists defending the values of the old regime faced off against a generation of romanticists demanding a transformation to meet new realities. Romanticism arrived in France early in the 19th century, and it became quickly entwined with countless societal divisions which were widening in the wake of revolution and the rise of Napoleon. By the mid-1820s, Romanticists were striving to recreate every art in their image. Their efforts generated bitter conflicts in nearly every French cultural institution and educational institution. The Romanticists produced a distinctive lifestyle of informality and indecorous behavior that deeply offended their elders. As the march of generational change swept through France's highly institutionalized artistic scene, the old royalists fought back. And in the process, the Romanticists discovered a wizard and hero of their own, Victor Hugo. Now, Hugo was an odd idol for rebellious youth. The son of a general in Napoleon's army, he was well connected among the country's most powerful families. Aesthetically, by contrast, he was proving to be a soulmate of his generation's Romanticists. Highly ambitious, Hugo deeply coveted a place in the prestigious Académie Française, representing the legendary 40 immortals of French literature. Denied more than once, the Academy elected him only as a member in 1841. He set out to storm the traditionalist ramparts. He began writing path-breaking novels such as Le Dernier Jour d'un Condamné, The Last Day of a Condemned Man, which chartered a new path to what would become a modern focus on the internal lives of literary protagonists. By the late 1820s, he agreed to an invitation from the Comédie Française to write a play to be performed in the company's elegant new home, the Théâtre de l'Odéon, next to the Luxembourg Gardens. Following the rejection of his first efforts by censors and eventually by the king himself, Hugo wrote a second play, Hernani. The story revolved around a beautiful Castilian maiden subjected to the unwanted advances of a repulsive old man. Hugo's verse drew on idiomatic, even provocative language to move the action inevitably to the joint suicide of Dona Sol and her lover, a Spanish brigand and disinherited nobleman, Hernani. Few spectators could miss the association of the desolate old man with the aging French monarch, Charles X. A group of offended classicist playwrights immediately petitioned the king, asking him to ban all Romanticist plays at the Comédie Française. When the effort failed, members of the Académie Française mobilized against the work. Meanwhile, brigands of youthful Romanticists rose in Hugo's defense. His supporters mobilized to find a way to the theater to lend vocal and at times physical support. The battle lines had been joined. Just about 1 p.m. in the afternoon of the opening performance, February 25th, 1830, lines formed surrounding the theater, closing nearby streets. Sporting long-haired beards, padded jackets, and purplish velvet, the assembling swarm appeared unlike the usual well-groomed Comédie Française audience crowd. Those who could forced their way in before the police sealed the theater off at 3. With hours before 7 p.m. curtain time, the intruders settled in for a long wait, chowing down on whatever food they had managed to sneak in concealed in their clothing. When offended usherettes refused to unlock the bathrooms, audience members relieved themselves on the auditorium floor. Theater staff went to the roof and threw garbage onto the crowd below. Late arriving traditional ticket holders found filth and chaos as they tried to find their seats. But calm did not descend when the curtain arose. Throughout the performance, the various sides shouted, booed, sang, and punched one another. The young Romanticists won the hour as the classicists in the audience beat a hasty retreat home. The battles continued throughout the play's 39 performance run, with audience members storming the stage, actors on many nights performing behind a line of soldiers, while some in the hall were bayoneted in the process. Conservative commentators rallied against lunatics and devil worshippers. I'm sure we've heard these phrases recently. And their liberal counterparts vilified intransigent guardians of an old order. Now, I'm telling this story because it's kind of obscure and it's well enough in the past that anyone listening to this lecture probably doesn't have an emotional investment in the story, as they might with other similar stories we can all think of once we start to think about these things. Hugo, of course, would go on to be one of France's most illustrious authors. The Comédie Française remained among France's most hallowed theater companies. Charles X did not fare as well. Within months of the final performance, he was run out of the country in what became known as the July Revolution. and he would die in Austrian exile a half dozen years later. So what we see in this story is a moment when conflicting artistic visions mix with generational change to set off all sorts of fireworks in the artistic world, which also spread into society. New audiences demand innovative works, new artistic visions. And the mayhem surrounding Théâtre d'Odéon reflect the arrival of innovative artistic representation. But that representation represented also deeper generational change in society. And I think it is a nice illustration of how, if we pay attention to what's taking place on stage, we can understand and appreciate what's taking place in society. There's another pattern I want to highlight, and this has to do with changing socioeconomic hierarchies. Now, English playhouses depended less on royal sanction and support than in France. London's vibrant commercial theater culture remained more diverse both on stage and in the audience. Late 18th and early 19th century commercial theaters brought together heterogeneous cross-sections of an English society divided by class, income, gender, political beliefs, and taste. Seating patterns confined lower classes to the upper gallery, while classes with who were more ordinary piled into the pit, the ground floor, and the elite sat in the middle in mid-tier boxes. Abuse and refuse hurled at the stage from the heights effortlessly fell on those in the pit. Disagreements over seating arrangements quickly escalated, and drunken patrons accelerated any argument. Fisticuffs easily broke out among contending groups as they passed one another in shared corridors and lobbies, often spilling into the street, coffee houses, and pubs. Numerous accounts tell of duelists having it out in the audience. In addition to what was happening in the theater and around the theater, reports of such goings-on in the era's sensationalist press spread the word well beyond the theater and immediate surroundings. Now, management's dependence on ticket sales only amplified the power of audience discontent. Battles broke out over various issues, including changes in programs, disagreements over politics and content, and animosity among fans of various actors. Such disturbances could last several evenings as audience members challenged standards of behavior which management tried to impose. At their core, they highlighted cavernous discrepancies between traditional expectations and ever-changing theatrical practices at a time of profound social and economic transformation. Fires at the outset of the 1808-1809 season destroyed London's two royal charter theaters, Covent Gardens and Drury Lane. The loss of both prestigious houses to fire spurred artistic, financial, and social changes that had been pressing on London theaters to adjust to new realities, but had been delayed. But once the royal theaters were gone, the pressure grew through the commercial theaters to change how the rules of the game of attendance were being played out. A new Covent Gardens opened in September 1809 with much pomp and circumstance. The opening night audience was in less than a celebratory mood, however, and general manager Philip Kimball's grandiloquent and jingoistic remarks attracted first coughs and sneers and then shouts and general disorder. Kimball summoned the police, who declared a riot by reading the 1714 Riot Act from the stage to warn of police action to follow. The audience began to disperse as a couple of dozen members of the audience rose to sing God Save the King. The story, however, wasn't open. Protests and violence erupted throughout the fall season. This became known as the infamous Old Price riots, which lasted 67 days and exposed deep social divisions within London. Now, as dramatic as the 1809 Old Price riots appear, they were a reversion to the previous century's consumer unrest. Professional and artisanal classes that had supported much of London's theatrical life revolted against what they saw as an unjust assertion of aristocratic privilege. The tumult subsided only after Kimball met with the protest leaders, fired an extravagantly paid Italian opera singer, Angelica Catalini, whose exorbitant salary justified price hikes, and restored previous prices. In recent days, there have been the disputes over tickets for Taylor Swift's new upcoming tour. That's a version in virtual space of what we're talking about in London in 1809. The affair wound down only after Kimball apologized for his unseemly pursuit of profit. But tensions had long played out between society's haves and have-nots through protests aimed at performances intended for the haves. Given the powerful connection of the arts to identity, different art forms provided a means for striking back at those with higher social status and economic power. And they often moved from inside the theater out to the streets. I want to turn now to a story, a different story. It focuses on rising nationalism. And it's an important story because it would have echo effects long beyond the actual incident I'm going to mention. And I want to talk about Irish theater for a moment. Now, theater has been a vital form and important outlet for contending Irish identities ever since the restoration of Charles II, if not before. Charles brought back theatrical entertainment to Ireland in 1662, as he had in England, by establishing the office of Master of Revels in Ireland. In doing so, he connected theater to the Crown's representatives in Dublin Castle. Few legitimate outlets existed in Ireland for the expression of the intense and bitter rivalries created by the island's profoundly factional, confessional, linguistic, national, class, and patronage landscape. Over time, a few commercial theaters joined the Royal Charter theaters. Touring companies ranged far and wide over the island, and an expanded Irish theater audience began to take shape. Leading writers, actors, and backstage artists frequently found their way to larger theater scenes in London to survive. New York stages joined the mix in the 19th century to form a Dublin, London, New York triad that supported Irish theater. But violence was bubbling up just below, and it boiled over at some performances as Ireland's culture wars intensified. Shipyard workers in Belfast infamously threw rivets at actors performing characters with whom they disagreed. Inebriated Trinity University students amused themselves by interrupting Dublin performances. A chasm opened up between popular nationalism and internationalist curiosity, or more simply, between theater as propaganda and theater as art. Against this backdrop, a band of parlor room intellectuals gathered one rainy afternoon in September 1897 at a County Galway summer estate, and they transferred Irish theater and arguably world theater. Initially including W.B. Yeats, Augusta Lady Gregory, and Edward Martin, they formulated a plan for advancing non-commercial Irish theater, written by Irish playwrights, performed by Irish actors for Irish audiences. Following initial seasons at the diminutive St. Teresa's Hall and slightly larger Molesworth Hall, the society changed its name to the Irish National Theatre Society and secured the Mechanics Institute on Abbey Street, next to the city morgue. The 562-seat Abbey Theatre, created within the Mechanics Institute building, opened on December 27th, 1904. This would become important because this notion of performing works written by us, performed by us for our audiences with no intermediary group intervening in this communication became a model later explicitly for efforts to create an African-American National Theater in Washington, D.C., and it influenced many efforts after 1917 in Ukraine as well, and in many other countries. It created a model for bringing one's own views to one's own community. Now, the Abbey drew rising literary whiz kid John Millington Synge into its circle. Synge, who would die of Hodgkin's disease in 1909 at the age of 37, had grown up in a well-off Anglo-Irish family. He was drawn to working-class Irish rural life, which he found a fascinating mixture of Roman Catholicism and ancestral nature worship. His harsh portrayals of village life proved too realistic for some nationalists, who preferred more idealized performances of Irish Catholic society. The nationalists were primed to be critical when his Playboy of the Western World opened at the Abbey Theater in January 1907. Word spread beforehand that Synge's play about a young Christy Mahon killing his father was anti-Catholic. Set in a County Mayo pub, Synge populated the cast with stereotypical local characters who greeted Mahon's confession that he had murdered his father with various degrees of praise and dismay. When it turned out that old Mahon had only been wounded, the town folks turned on the young Christy. Old Mahon saved his son from the crowd bent on vengeance only after a second attempt at murder had failed. In the end, Mahon's father and son reconcile and leave town after having exposed the dismal, brutish, dead-end life of the Irish village. Defenders of Irish national honor were not amused. The hall was packed opening night, Saturday, January 26th. Unease and discomfort grew throughout the first act as the audience realized what had begun as a comedy parroting rural life was turning increasingly dark. The story takes a nasty turn following Christie's second failed attempt at murder when a girl pulls off her petticoat for the young man to use as a disguise. Insult was added to injury when actor Willie Fay flubbed his lines in a way that insulted Irish womanhood. The hisses began. The actors attempted to continue until noise had become too great. The police arrived and the performance stumbled to its conclusion with insults and brawls breaking out as the house lights came up and continued into the street. An enraged crowd for both sides of the nationalist divide gathered for the play's second showing. Trinity University students and local toughs rushed the doors, setting off a scrum for the best seats. The play continued for a while until actor Willie Fay made his first appearance as Christy Mahon, resulting in anarchy. More and more police arrived to calm the crowd as open warfare broke out. Both sides picked up supporters outside as havoc spilled onto the Trinity campus and across the river, only to be calmed by dawn. Protests and arrests continued for the remainder of the play's week-long run, subsiding in intensity with each passing performance. But the story didn't end there. When the Abbey Theater went on tour in the United States, the premiere of this play in Philadelphia with former President Teddy Roosevelt in the audience was broken up by the police for violating decency laws. So we see in these stories, which at first glance seem far away and somewhat idiosyncratic, it turns out there are patterns here. The patterns reflect how the arts respond and help create deeper changes in society. And we should pay attention to these moments because they tell us that something is going on that maybe we wouldn't see in other ways. Now, many theater goers, having been schooled by in American culture, Victorian-inspired middle class and Ukraine Soviet-era conceptions of decorum, think of the performing arts as objects of veneration to be respected. And they tend to disassociate the arts and the performances with what's going on outside. But such almost religious reverence limits applause to carefully controlled moments, demands cessation of audience conversation, and frowns on bad behavior. Norms of propriety require that audience members check the outside world at the door upon entering a temple of art, be it a mega-sized opera house or a tiny studio theater. But such notions of appropriateness are quite recent. Indeed, Richard Wagner is part of the reason why we have them, but that's a different story. The communal connections arising when people gather to witness beauty, passion, and creativity demand less decorum than we might think. Audience behavior at early opera performances was closer to a Rolling Stones concert than to Germanic symphony halls. And just as many jazz musicians today complain about audience members talking during the performances, Mozart complained bitterly that his listeners would continue their conversations when he was playing. In some instances, uproarious behavior bordering on full-fledged riots have provided early indications of profound conflicts taking shape within society. And in this instance, I think back to a performance of Ukrainian ballet I saw in the Kiev Opera House in 2013 that erupted in the end with demonstrations against the dismissal of the artistic director. These disturbances, I would argue, reflect new moments in social development, new artistic moments, new economic moments, new national identities. And we should begin to look at places like a theater for indications of what's taking place in society as a whole. A night at the theater, the concert hall, or a nightclub is always more than an entertaining backdrop. It's a moment to see what really is going on in society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rubel. Thank you for a great lecture. And I know that we have got a question from Natalia Vysotska. Natalia, are you here? Are you with us? I know. Okay, so
Yes,
you're welcome.
yes, sure I am. Hello.
Hey, Natalia.
Hello there. Great to see
Natalia
you.
Vysotska is a professor of Kiev Linguistic University and a specialist in theater, literary studies, American literature, etc. So Natalia, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Blair, for reminding us about the role theater can play and does play in our life, apart from providing some entertainment and even aesthetic pleasure. And what you've been saying made me think about another example of a similar character. And I mean the Astor Place riot in 1849. Because of course it was not so much about the different manners of acting, yes, practiced by Forrest and Macready, but it was again about great social divisions in the American society and about the emerging nationalism. What is your view of that incident?
Well, I almost included it in this lecture, and it was that incident is what drew me to this subject. For those who don't know, it was in. Do you remember the year? It was in the 1830s.
1849.
1849.
Yes.
It was one of the worst outbreaks of civic violence in New York, ending with dozens, maybe even hundreds of people being killed as the army had to be called out. And it had to do with an opera house putting on a performance of, it was a Hamlet or Macbeth? Macbeth. With a famous British actor, that really was revered by upper class New Yorkers, and the opera house actually was sitting on a kind of social fault line between poor Irish neighborhoods and upscale neighborhoods. And American nationalists organized a performance by an American actor opposite it. and tried to shut down the Opera House production of Macbeth, and actually tried to set fire to the theater with the audience members in it. And it ended with the army being called out, as I said, and it's one of the most violent civil disturbances in New York City history, right down to today. And that story made me realize, as I began to delve into it, exactly what I'm talking about, that theater becomes ingrained in the society that's it's in, and it becomes symbolic of the divisions of the society, and it gives not only voice but a focal point to disputes that had long been simmering. Now, in the case of the Astor House opera riot, there was a longer story to this, which the two actors had been rivals for a very long time, following each other around England and the United States, rallying their fans to protest. But this was an incident that totally got out of hand. And Natalia, I thank you for bringing it up, because I think it's what drew me to this subject. I don't know if you want to add anything, but.
Yeah. All right. And I just wanted to tell you that now we have Brian Friel's translations running at one of the Kiev theaters, and it is very relevant for our situation today. And I think, well, the production is not, perfect, but still the play itself, I think, is very rich and resonant.
Right, right.
Mhm.
No, I purposefully chose examples that may have lost their emotional impact today, because I wanted to kind of highlight on the process. But it's very easy to take any of these incidents and bring it into the contemporary period. And certainly in Ukraine, we can see this, but we can see it elsewhere as well. Right now in the United States, we don't have violence breaking out of theaters, but we have deep artistic disputes over how to bring greater diversity to American theater. So it's another example of how theater is reflecting and working through the challenges that society as a whole faces. And it's a plea to actually pay attention to the kind of social, political, broad cultural aspect of performance, and not just to its quote unquote artistic value.
All right, thank you, Blair. And I just wonder whether you have heard about such movement as in your face theater, popular in Britain nowadays, very much popular there. And in your opinion, what social events does it reflect?
Well, I think in your face theater is a really important development coming out of the end of the 20th century, at a time when English society was increasingly divided, and it became a mechanism for be in your face, and it drew heavily on so-called documentary theory, taking actual events from the street and bringing them to the stage. What's interesting is with the support of the British Council in the 1990s, it became the basis for a new kind of Russian theater that had some success until Putin and the Orthodox Church pulled the rug out from under it. And in-your-face theater also has had a very large impact on European theater, less so on this side of the Atlantic. But what's interesting about it is also there are some societies where it never quite had an impact. France, Italy, where in Eastern Europe, it really spoke to the deep divisions that were just very raw following 1991. So I think it's another, it's a little bit different because it doesn't lead to the outbreaks that I'm talking about of violence, but it also is a very good example of art reflecting differences in society. Another contemporary example, it's a music one, but is the emergence of hip hop from the Bronx and the poorest neighborhoods in New York City in the 1970s, becoming an international phenomenon. Now the largest selling, most commercially successful music genre we have. That actually grew out of a blend of Black American and Caribbean Black immigrants living in the poorest neighborhoods of New York. And it's also interesting, over time, these genres become accepted by everybody. So you have the story of hip hop moving from the South Bronx to Broadway in a generation. That's also another part of the story, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And taking into consideration the modern tendencies, I mean that here in Ukraine, considering the war circumstances, the actors and the singers perform in the underground, etc. Do you think it can influence some mechanisms, art mechanisms, or maybe give birth to some new genres, or it will just disappear after the war ends?
As you may know, I've been writing about how artists are responding to the war in Ukraine, and it's an inspiring story. And it is one of many examples of the determination of Ukrainians to have their own country and be themselves. And I do think when the war is over, there will be an explosion of artistic creativity, or a better way of thinking about it is the artistic creativity that is taking place now will be given larger stages and will explode out into the world in ways that are less visible now because the opportunities aren't there. You know, I think of a very different kind of example, but what I'm talking about, a group of jazz musicians, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and others, were playing in Minton's up in Harlem during the early 1940s, but they weren't recording because there was a musician strike against recording. So they were playing up there for 2 or 3 years, and then it was during World War II, and then the union agreements were reached, the war ended, and suddenly all of these incredible performances of what we now know as bebop burst out of nowhere. And the history tends to say, well, it just came out of nowhere. Well, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was something that was being perfected in the equivalent of a dark basement in uptown New York. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in Ukraine. I think we're going to see a flourishing of arts, which will then influence, will leap over Ukrainian borders and influence culture in other places as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you for a fabulous lecture. I think all of us have what to think about and what to analyze afterwards. And I thank the American Embassy in Ukraine once more for supporting this project and for making this lecture possible as well. And I think that we will wind up our stream. And if you have
Before
a few
you do,
minutes,
let me just say one thing.
of course.
Anybody who looks at this later on the Facebook feed, if they have a question, they can reach me through Facebook.
Oh, thank you.
So just send me a message on Facebook and I'll try to respond.
Or just leave your question under the video and we will send it to Mr. Rubel.
Good.
So thank you. Thank everyone who has joined us, and thanks to everyone who's going to watch us later. So I stop streaming, and I guess if you have a few minutes, we could just talk for a few minutes.
Well,